Saturdays were a very special day for me when I was growing up. As far as I can remember, my dad took me to the synagogue every Saturday for the Shabbos service. Some years later, at the age when I learned to speak, I started to learn some psalms. Psalms that later on would have a sentimental value for me. What was so fascinating for me was the ritual and the ceremony. Everyone knew exactly what to do and when to do it. There was this clear structure through all the service. My interests for the religion were growing and were highly competing with my plastic gun and my Game Boy. My religiosity became a platform for the existential questions one can have, but also a place to grow questions. The mystery of God's existence, but most of all, the knowledge that was surrounded by it, were motivating me to wanting to know more. The more I learned, the more questions were developed. And the cause of this was that I started with private lessons 1 to 2 a week for the rabbi to study the Torah and the Talmud. And through Talmud, I started to gain an interest for Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, which had a huge impact on me. The Kabbalah is poetical. And what I found was that the surface of truth, observed on a distance, had a clear structure. But as I said before, knowledge gives birth to more questions. And the closer I look to the surface of truth, the more it does not make sense. And that is what I love about it. There is this eternal, fractal pattern, layers of knowledge, which is not quite leading to an answer, only leading to another state of being. This metaphor for existential question formulation could be the same metaphor for the artist who is searching for patterns, who is searching for absolute answers in artistic issues. By the age of 10, I had still no contact with music other than just listening to it. But now, in the rear view, I can now see how I'm enjoying the same spiral mentioned above. But now, as an artist, as a composer, or a sound architect, an organizer of sound. So when I was around 14 years old, my father repaired a good old broken 19 synthesizer. It had a program with various pieces it could play up. For example, a piece by Mozart, Alla Turca. By ear and with very anarchistic fingering, I learned to play that piece by myself. My mother was encouraging me to take a piano lesson, but as the hormones were turning me into a rebellious youngster, I was more interested in playing rock music than classical. But you know what? I couldn't deny my passion, so I took one lesson. And that lesson would change my life. My piano teacher, Regina, and I, we had so much fun. And we were basically just playing around. Although that she were from the Russian teaching tradition, she was very kind to me. She didn't demand anything from me, so instead of wasting time on boring scales and sight reading, I went directly to learn my new favorite piece back then, Toccata in D minor by Bach. I loved it. And I loved Bach. And I saw patterns, and the patterns was my key to memorize everything. Today, I would know these patterns as musical theory. And the same way I was approaching Judaism, I was now approaching music. And at this age, I were vividly questioning my belief in the veracity that I had collected. I felt secure enough to resolve them. For me, religion is demanding some absolute facts, while the art does not. Art does not demand anything from you except that you keep going and keep questioning. But of course, it wasn't from one day to another that I went from a believer to an agnostic. The religiosity were overlapped by the music. Though it went quite fast for me to decide that it was music that I wanted to devote my life to, still, to devote to something, you would have to know something about it. Think about it. If I instead wanted to become a medical doctor, it would already be a path for me telling me what to do to become one. The thing is that you need to know the path. Being passionate about it isn't enough. I come from a family where no one is a professional musician, so this was as unfamiliar to them as it was to me. I started to play for a Russian, and this time the hardcore type, and my piano technique were about to bloom. But there was something in the way for me to succeed as a pianist, and that is my Achilles heel. I have dyslexia, which makes it incredibly hard for me to read and write, and of course, read and write music. Later on, I will come up with this great idea to become a composer, where basically everything is about reading and writing. Anyway, at the end of 2009, I had the opportunities to study piano with Staffan Scheja, the vice principal for the Royal College of Music in Stockholm. I told you that I really knew nothing at this time. So, composer, pianist, what's the difference? Sight reading, was it really that important to learn all of that? Yes, of course it was. The ambitions that I had demanded it from me. I struggled with sight reading a lot by myself without any success, and it was a really tough time for me. I was doubting myself, and it became a halo effect. I wasn't too good in school either because of my dyslexia, and I was kind of lazy too. So. Then, one cold winter night here in Stockholm, I was working as a casual bar pianist at this Christmas party. And suddenly, I was asked to play some Liszt, and I did. And then something happened which had never happened before. I played wrong, and worse than that I had a total blackout. So instead of continue playing Liszt, I started to play one of my own pieces, because I was more comfortable with my own improvisations. After I played, a man walks up to me, a composer. A composer that would and will matter tremendous to me. I met Sven-David Sandström, a world-famous composer. He introduced me to contemporary music, and I have never heard such things. It was magical, and at the same time, so weird. The creation, and as I mentioned earlier, the questions, was the foreground in the ear of the composer. Sven-David came to my school once a week to give me private lessons, and that reliance were essential for me to devote myself into becoming a composer. He required from me that I would learn notation, or you won't be able to compose in your way that you're aiming for, he said. Sven-David encouraged me to apply to a school in Gotland, a Swedish island in the middle of the Baltic Sea. I went there to learn notation and compositional craftsmanship. These 2 years of education made it possible for me to apply to the Royal College of Music here in Stockholm, and later on be an exchange student at the Royal College of Music in London, where I'm now studying. Thank you. And there is where I stand today. I mentioned earlier that I was improvising, but I was rather improvising than composing, and it was something like this. Thank you. At this time, I could not read music, but I desperately wanted to play Chopin. So this was my interpretation and the embryo for my interest to compose. I did not know the difference between a concert pianist and a composer was. Chopin, he wrote his own works, didn't he? But this is not how it works. A composer, especially not from the 20th century, does not play his own works, at least not more than an architect can build his own skyscraper. So what does a composer do exactly? Actually, quite the same as the architect does. He makes an abstraction of the building he wants to create, and then comes the executant and execute. The executant in this example would be the construction workers. Of course, there are some steps in between the construction workers, but Anyway, the counterpart to the executant in music would be the musicians who plays what I have written down on a piece of paper. At Gotland, I were exposed for a lot of music, especially a lot of contemporary music. For me, it was like being exposed to a language that you never heard. And I had some problems to relate to it. Think about it. How does one observe a piece regardless of its medium? Well, your subconscious and your conscience will search for patterns that you can recognize, relate to. It is as easy as when you pick up a vegetable to eat. You need to recognize the cucumber's color and shape to eat it. And if it would deviate too much, you would probably not eat it. Art, music, is a vegetable that is continuous in its alteration. A very good example when we weren't able to identify the vegetable were when Marcel Duchamp exhibit the pissoir in 1914, a so-called ready-made. Now it should come up something, and there it is. People were drawing an equivalent between a painting and art. And I think that's a big mistake, and I think people still do. The people saw nothing except the pissoir out of use. Today, we would look at it as a question formulation for what is art. Most of the people is used to hear music which is based on a tonal system. A system that is based on the physical law of a frequency. When you recognize a song that you haven't heard before, it is because tonal music includes a high level of predictability. There are rules, and you would be surprised how attached your brain is to them. Even in 12-tone music, which is a compositional craftsmanship, is a tool to break free from the tonal system, but our mind still doesn't. Actually, not hearing the notes in a chord, for example a G flat, is as hard as not hearing the words with the sounds that I'm making with my voice. I mean, that's why it's so easy to hear if another language that you don't understand is beautiful, because the sounds is not significant with a word. So instead, you are enjoying the melody and the phrasing of it. Maybe we looked at the same way at the pissoir as the first time we heard 433 by John Cage. I'm not going to play it up because it's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. So there's a piece of silence for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and the piece is saying so much by saying nothing. It is quiet, but not absolutely quiet. What you suddenly do is that you're making the soundscape that surrounds us visible. So one of the important things the piece does is questioning what is music. And by questioning that, he led our focus to somewhere else. Somewhere our ears had only filtered as non-important information. In some way, John Cage's music is learning us not only how to read between the lines, but also how to listen between them. And that sound, music, can very much stand for itself. I don't need music to explain love or a sound to fall in love with another sound. I can love sound, traffic rain, bubble plastic, just as they are. To create his music, he uses a lot of chance methods. One of his famous ways to do this is through the I Ching, which is the oldest work in Chinese literature. It is essential work within the Taoism. And just like Kabbalah, this work has inspired more people to study it than just the religious ones. For example, Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, who was a mathematician, wrote in the 18th century a thesis about binary numbers. It is so interesting how so many great composers and artists seem to seek outside the walls of just music. Something so unmusical as numbers, structures of nature, golden section, all this can be such a powerful tool to overwin your own very limited capacity of creativity. This is a tool to get beyond perhaps your ego. That's the same thing when you do when you're praying for a very, very long time, or as the Islamic Sufistana does when they Sufi whirling, a dance to set up yourself in a transcendental being. Bach, he loved numbers, and people seem to think that Bach's music is about feelings. I mean, you can get very sentimental by listening to it. But when he wrote it, I would dare to say that his compositional technique is witnessing about almost an algorithmic way of composing, in the sense that he uses a system, using structures and making rules. For example, the fugue, which really looks like a fractal movement. This is a Romancesco broccoli, and it has a beautiful mathematic structure of it. One thematic structure which divides itself to several parts growing from fragments from the origin theme. I really don't mean that a computer could replace a composer, because there's so much more to it. When I write music, for example a piece for trio, 2 double basses and 1 percussionist, I try to relate to all of this. All of the aspects of listening between the lines, and also the aspects of sound and time. I seem to think about music from an acousmatic point of view. I want to understand the qualities of the sound. So I wanted to create a structure where the sounds of the percussion instrument, which were highly complex and rich sounds, would be the foreground in the musical structure. One of the sounds I got from a timpani with a cymbal on its top, and the percussion player would drag a rubber ball on it to provide friction, which generates the sound. To have it as a form, I would of course need to look at the structure of the sound itself to be able to build it out, like a house of cards. So I was sampling the percussion instruments, recording them, and then I took it into my computer to make a fast Fourier transform analysis to look at the qualities of the sound and its spectrum, as you can see in this picture. And this is, I did it, my friend, colleague, Patrick, did this in MATLAB. And as you can see, this is actually a sound that is freezed in time. So this is how sounds looks like when it's freezed. After that, I wanted to organize this in a certain way. And I'm quite often, and also, if you want to listen to the sound of the timpani and with the cymbal. As you can hear, it almost sounds electronically, but I promise you that it's not. After that, I wanted to organize this in a certain way, and I'm quite often thinking about the given structures by nature. Quite often I do some decisions on proportion based on the Fibonacci series. Not because they are magical, but the proportion is obviously existing in a lot of art pieces independent of its medium. Leonardo da Vinci, Debussy, Bartók. You will find a lot of golden section in their music. For me, listening between the lines is also about not listening to music in such a linear way. We humans, especially in the West, seem to think from everything that everything is very linear, a linear timeline. But reality, whatever that may be, is more complex than that. When you hear a piece of music, I think that you're actually listening to what happened at the moment, of course. Simultaneously, you are listening to the past, and by that, you're already listening to the future. This way of thinking was resulting in a piece based on a really limited material that, observed on a distance, the closer you listen to the piece, the more you will notice the pitch. By really focusing on just one spot, you will find the inner core of the pitch that unfolds and blooming out to a beautiful harmony. I might write 2, 3, perhaps 4 pieces a year. And this is kind of a comment to our society, where we are expected to be so productive. We should work, maybe have a TEDx speech, and simultaneously, of course, upload a little selfie and maybe a muffin on Instagram. All this at the same time. What I have always tried is to find a depth in something specific and staring at it for a very, very long time. That, for me, is what devoting is all about. Thank you.